Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second in-person lecture of the semester. Before introducing our lecture, Rob, I think it's a little too loud. Just a tiny bit. Thank you. So I just have to acknowledge and thank the entities that make this event possible. This has been co-sponsored by the Five College Architectural Theory Seminar, the UMass Department of Architecture, and Amherst College and Mount Holyoke College's Architectural Studies programs. Our guest tonight is Esra Akcan. She is Michael McCarthy Professor in the Department of Architecture at Cornell. Her research on modern and contemporary architecture and urbanism programs the intertwined histories of Europe and West Asia, and offers new ways to understand architecture's role in global, social, and environmental justice. She's the author of Landfill Istanbul, Architecture in Translation, Turkey, Modern Architecture and History, and this one is co-authored with Sibel Bozdogan, Open Architecture, Migration, Citizenship, and Urban Renewal of Berlin-Kreuzberg. Her upcoming books are Building in Exile, Abolish Human Balance, and Right to Heal. Akcan has received numerous awards and fellowships from institutions such as the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard, the Brown Foundation, the American Academy in Berlin, Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin, Clark Institute, the Getty, the Canadian Center for Architecture, the Mellon Foundation, and on and on. In her meticulous scholarship, Akcan asks difficult questions and take architecture and architects to the task of situating themselves in a world that manifests social, environmental, and human crises at an alarming rate. It continuously strives to bring to the fore the voice of the stateless, those of the migrants, exilees, refugees, among others. Akcan advocates for an architecture that is radical, humane, and attuned to the voice and presence of those whose very existence has been systematically and continuously erased. Please join me in welcoming Esra.
Can you hear me? Is that good? Okay, great. Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for being here. Obviously, I would like to thank Perry for inviting me, also Robert and Julie for making this possible, and the faculty and students who joined my seminar today. We had already a great time. I hear an echo, but it's fine for you. Okay, great. So thanks again for inviting me. So this lecture is a chapter from my book in progress, Right to Heal. So this book that I'm proposing explores architecture's role in healing societies after conflicts and disasters by discussing buildings and spaces in relation to transitional justice and energy transition. It critically examines opportunistic responses to crisis that forecloses the right to heal, and at the same time demonstrates architecture's potential for a more meaningful repair after socioeconomic, ethico-political, and ecological disasters. So this study locates spaces of political and ecological harm and makes a call to repurpose these spaces as healing spaces where violence and violations are confronted and accountability and reparations are instituted. And each chapter discusses a distinct type of conflict and disaster in conjunction with related architectural programs. So as chapters proceed from the healing of an individual to that of a village, a city, the world, and the earth, they also demonstrate that sudden shocks that we have in societies do actually have deep roots in history. So I will locate the real causes of present wounds in the intertwined processes of colonization, nationalization, urbanization, and neoliberalization. So this book started with a premise. I think to insist on imagining a better future may be the most meaningful resistance against the destructive powers in times of crisis. So I ask questions like how reversible is damage due to internal social conflicts. How does a post-disaster society accomplish justice? Through architecture. There's a considerable literature on reconstruction after wars, after international wars, but the topic of reparations after internal, social, state, or business-led aggressions is underexplored. If buildings have historically been the media through which the ruling powers erect their monuments and inscribe their control at the expense of natural and social fabrics, can they also become platforms where societies move toward healing? So for today's lectures, I decided to look more closely at an individual's right to heal, namely the right to heal from enforced disappearance of a relative or a loved one. I'll explain what that is. So I would like to unpack how this case fits at least two contemporary discussions. The first is the need to confront and reckon with the injustices of the past whose wounds we are still living today. I will suggest to place the new conventions of human rights at the center of the healing process for such a reckoning with the prolonged and unresolved cases of injustice. The other topic is the role of architectural programs and physical spaces in this reckoning, such as urban squares, cemeteries, and monuments and memorials. So this lecture is divided into three parts. First, I will comment on the new conventions of human rights and introduce the concepts of transitional justice and right to truth. Second, I will focus on a case in Istanbul, and then I will zoom back out to examples from around the world to discuss the role of architectural design in reparations and reparatory justice. I realize that the design is coming at the end, so I hope you'll be patient with me. So let me start with part one. What exactly are human rights? Despite its omnipresent use in daily language, the definition of human rights as a concept has not been settled easily and remains, there are points of it that remain unresolved. The concept of human rights has received its own share of suspicion and reproach from authors at different ends of the political spectrum. The far right, press for instance, around the world, portray human rights as an alibi to protect criminals and constrain governments from punishing them. Or historically speaking, Jeremy Bentham, back in the days, ridiculed the foundational premise of human rights, that all human beings are born free. Perhaps this is to be expected from the inventor of the panoptic prisons, who attempted to discipline human bodies through an architectural device. Bentham ridiculed the idea that natural and inalienable rights should be distinct from legal rights, because he claimed that that would be an invitation to anarchy. Karl Marx famously opposed, at the other end of the spectrum, Karl Marx famously opposed human rights for their egoistic preoccupation to protect individuals rather than political communities. Or as early as Olympe de Gouges and Mary Wollstonecraft's appeals, feminist critique exposed the hypocrisy of gender discrimination in the initial declarations of human rights that advocated the rights of man and citizen. Another common objection has been the assertion that the concept of human rights is a Western invention, and therefore its universalization is an imperialist expansion. This accusation that Amartya Sen defined as cultural critique, and he also showed the unsubstantiation, the grounds of this accusation. But still, episodes when Western superpowers use human rights as an excuse for military intervention to serve other interests stand as the worst scandals in human rights history. So some of these policies have been corrected, others have been unresolved, but the concept of human rights still today continues to be relevant for moral commitment to rectify injustice and ensure equality, or for political action to protect human dignity, enable participatory democracy, or still for the education of the senses to build empathy with the oppressed. So despite numerous challenges from skeptics that I showed, the claim to natural rights has never been quite defeated, as Margaret McDonald summarized. I'm quoting from her, it tends in some form to be renewed in every crisis in human affairs when the plain citizen tries to make or expects his leaders to make, articulate his obscure but firmly held conviction that he is not a mere pawn in any political game, nor the property of any government or ruler, but the living and protesting individual. So after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the United Nations Human Rights Commission continued to add new treatises that are open to the country's member states' ratification. Initially, there were the first two conventions aimed to resolve the ideological split between Cold War superpowers. As the number of member states increased during decolonization processes after 1960s, and responding to the several social movements around the globe, the UN added new conventions, such as the ones for the elimination of racial discrimination, or the elimination of discrimination against women, as well as conventions against torture, the rights of the child, and so on. So here you see which countries ratified how many of these 18 new human rights conventions. There are 18 new human rights conventions that have been added since the 1948 initial declaration. So against this background, I would like to focus on the role of human rights in architectural theory. Even though the topic of human rights is relevant for multiple social sciences and humanities fields, it has been overwhelmingly perceived as a legal matter, administered by the United Nations. So the perception of human rights as an exclusively legal and governmental matter assumes that there should be a responsible institution whose duty is to deliver human rights. And it operates as if something could be defined as a human right only if it can be combined with an institutional obligation. So this is important for the implementation of human rights, but I think it has narrowed down the cultural discussions about the topic, and I would like to explore architecture's contribution to this topic. So one of the new treatises that I mentioned, one of the 218 ones that were adopted in 2006, was the Convention on the Protection from Enforced Disappearance. Enforced disappearance means not returning from state custody due to a possibly torturous or secret murder. This convention also defines a right to truth, and it has opened up, as I will argue here, new potentials for architecture's relevance for human rights. So enforced disappearance has long been a common act of military juntas and oppressive governments. Retroactively, the Night and Fog Directive of the Nazi regime in the 1930s is the first officially recognized example in the world of enforced disappearance. But the United Nations and Amnesty International have warned that the practice actually increased and spread over the world after 1980, with systematic cases in Argentina, Chile, China, East Germany, Guatemala, Iraq, Russia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Turkey, USA, and many others. A report in August 2014 of the UN Working Group reported that there are more than 43,000 unresolved cases of disappearances in 88 different states, including the United States and Turkey. So I'll be looking at one set of these cases, and let me introduce that. So on March 21, 1995, Hassan Hajab was taken into state custody, and he never came back. When his relatives searched for him in police stations, they always got the same reply, that he had never been there. As the family and friends continued a sit-in for his release, they found a photograph of his tortured body in the forensic office, and learned that his corpse was discovered in a forest and buried in a cemetery for unknown people. On Saturday, May 27, his mother and siblings made their first weekly demonstration at Istanbul's Galatasaray Square in front of a school, together with 5 families in the same situation. They called themselves Saturday Mothers, referring to Mothers of Plaza de Mayo of Argentina, who also visited them in one of those Saturdays. As their determination grew, so did the police violence. As weeks passed by, more mothers came to demonstrations. Hassan's mother aged, but his younger sister and brother took active roles. The parents died, but the family, so newborn children, joined. And then came other human rights activists. So this case is one of the thousands around the world who who has not returned from state custody. And this talk is about human rights, but also about those who were left behind. The Saturday Mothers of Istanbul, or Turkey, a growing group of mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, wives, husbands, children, grandchildren, aunts, uncles, as well as human rights defendants and citizens in solidarity, have been asking for the whereabouts of more than 13,000 individuals that disappeared after the military coup of 1980, and they have been protesting in Istanbul Square, Central Square, since 1995, every Saturday. So Hasan Ocak's case is a typical example of what is now named as enforced disappearance, and the state's denial of accountability is a violation of right to truth. Both, as I said, are recognized as crimes in international law since 2006 through a convention that is signed by 98 countries and ratified by 62 to this day. Please note that neither Turkey nor the United States has signed this convention, Human Rights Convention, yet. So those subject to enforced disappearance expose how modern states turn bodies into what Georgia Agamben called bare life, in the sense that states hold the power to deprive citizens of their political rights and push them outside the realm that should have been protected by citizenship rights. And turning humans into bare lives gives those states necro-power, as Achille Mbembe coined the term. It gives the states a license, a presumed right to kill with impunity. So the history of transitional justice is actually very tightly related to enforced disappearance. The accountability for past abuses in history came to the forefront of human rights movements with the grassroots protests against enforced disappearance, such as the one by Mothers of Plaza de Mayo in Argentina starting in 1977. Enforced disappearance proved to be a very characteristic crime in many countries in transition whose post-conflict commissions tried to institute a never-again policy, including Chile, El Salvador, South Africa, and others. The concept of transitional justice entered the lexicon of international law as new nations emerged out of the end of the Cold War and with conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. So this is the official definition of transitional justice, written by Kofi Annan, or when Kofi Annan was Secretary General of UN. It is the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. So in addition to UN, the regional courts are also very active. Inter-American Court of Human Rights that combines both North and South America, European Court of Human Rights, or African Court of Human and People's Rights have been very active in coming to terms with this. So I suggest to analyze transitions from not only military regimes, but civil wars, genocides, apartheids, as well as reparations to heal from colonization and slavery as multidisciplinary topics of transitional justice. So the Saturday Mothers make three specific demands. They want to know what happened to their relatives under state custody, they want to see the perpetrators punished, and they want to find the disappeared or the remnants of their bodies so that they can bury their dead. Over the years, they also shown solidarity with other atrocities in the country's history. Namely, the Saturday Mothers appeal for truth, justice, and a space for their relatives, and by extension, a moral and institutional reform for the society. These requests actually fall very squarely on the goals, mechanisms, and steps theorized by transitional justice scholars. For instance, in one of the first books with the title, categorized forms of transitional law as criminal, historical, reparatory, administrative, and constitutional justice. Or another scholar, Pablo de Grave, defined four goals of transitional justice as recognition, civic trust, reconciliation, and democratization. And we identified several measures to reach that, including truth commissions and so on. After interviews with Saturday Mothers, the Truth Justice Memory Center came up with four suggestions: trials, truth commissions, compensation programs, and institutional reforms. So the right to truth is one of these goals, that oversees the right of the relatives or the society to know the truth about state brutality and human rights violations in the past, which had been obscured due to the denial of responsibility or distortion of facts in official national histories. In other words, truth and recognition of suffering is a prerequisite for healing. As my colleague Natia put it, I'm quoting from him, the new human rights culture has been accompanied by the global diffusion of the psychoanalytic ideas about the healing power of truth. So after Argentina, truth commissions have been instituted and suggested in several countries that are in process of confronting with several historical cases of state violence. For instance, the Bloody Sunday of 1972 in Ireland had a truth commission. But sometimes the right to truth claims injected a dilemma into the healing process, because truth commissions were established during transitional periods and they secured amnesties and forgiveness to perpetrators in return of collaboration. Truth, in other words, was revealed at the expense of criminal justice. And a history of transitional justice might be neatly written by showing the dilemma between truth and criminal justice and the historical struggles in different countries to minimize it. To give you a little bit more of an idea, for instance, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission during South Africa's transition from the apartheid regime is a case in point. They began public hearings in 1996, and this commission heard testimonies from 2,000 people and compiled written reports from 23,000 people to reach the truth of the apartheid violence. But sometimes there was a dilemma injected. For instance, Stephen Biko's family protested that his enforced recipient was not punished, and amnesty was granted to perpetrators. The court rejected the family's appeal with the declaration that it would not have been possible to attain a peaceful transition to a democratic society otherwise. The defendants of the Truth Commission argued that the decision reflected the local conception of justice in South Africa, which seemed better with forgiveness, harmony, and peace, rather than criminal justice, rather than punishment. It was the best of possible options. It was therapeutic for victims. It was the best way to reconciliation. In opposition, in Argentina, the right to truth movement and protests against impunity of the previous military regime eventually led to a new form of trial specific to this country. So there are different forms of reaching this truth in different countries. So, and it's an unresolved issue, let's say. Transitional justice is also not resolved because subsequent regimes in these countries were also far from perfect themselves. Their truths and their justices were also partial. In many cases, results were compromising or even flawed. Reparations were like whitewashing devices. Financial compensations were symbolic. Institutional reforms gave unfair advantages to the new regime supporters. Moreover, the assumption of the objectivity and universality of international law is also rightly debated. For instance, a comparative ethnographic and sociological study in Bosnia, Rwanda, Iraq, and Uganda revealed that conception of justice among countries vary. Societies respond to violations differently. Methods that they use to find justice differ. Reconciliation means forgiveness in some countries, but punishment in others. There is no direct correlation between victimhood and the desire for war crime trials. Individual opinions about justice in a given country are also skewed according to nationalist and ethnocentric propaganda. They depend on social and economic factors and so on. So international laws, when it is ignorant of the democratic practices of justice, sabotages the growth of democratic societies. When it is perceived as a toolkit that can be applied anywhere by this UN without translation, this mechanism also forecloses the right to heal. But these are all unresolved issues. So in the context of these unfinished struggles toward right to truth, the imperfect conditions of transitions, and unreconciled international and national laws, I think transitional justice needs to be conceived as a continually evolving, self-reflective and open platform. where societies need to find and formulate new forms of justice and peace-building steps, in addition to the ones that have already been mentioned, or that have already been devised. And I would like to think with you today, with Saturday Mothers, for such an opening and for architecture's role in this. So architecture, I think, is a newfound but untapped relevance in this new theory of human rights, or in these new conventions of human rights. This involves both the spaces of human rights activism as well as retrospective and prospective mechanisms. And I will unpack these today. I will try to show how, I will try to unpack these treatments today. So part 2, and let me illustrate this with the case of Istanbul. So take the Saturday Mothers movement at Istanbul's Galatasaray squares, for instance. This social movement invites discussions of not only human rights, but also feminism and gender, psychoanalysis of mourning, memory. Additionally, I would like to amplify the moments where the social movements for human rights intersects with the city and its architecture, and how this intersection potentially contributes to healing. Countless interviews with the relatives in Istanbul and Kurdish majority towns have revealed that Saturday Mothers cannot grieve their losses with conventional mourning rituals. And they're not facing the facts without learning the truth about the whereabouts of the bodies. Therefore, Kırbayır, for instance, who died at age 105, left her house door open every night after 1980, hoping that her son Cemil will return. While depriving citizens of their political rights, state violence simultaneously throws their relatives out of the sphere of social mourning. Reading Freud's seminal text Mourning and Melancholia critically, we may ask how much ordinary forms of mourning could work for subjects who have been excluded from the socially constructed definition of the normal. Melancholy, the inability to have closure in grief, is not a pathological response in this case, as it would have been deemed in the normative psychoanalysis, but the only option left to relatives, which they have fought back by turning their perpetual grief, their melancholy, into activism. So mourning and protesting in one of the busiest public spaces of Istanbul meant precisely that. Every week, the relatives brought red flowers to the square that they would have otherwise taken to cemeteries. Sharing pain as a form of resistance helped to live with the unbelievable loss. Yet the Galatasaray Square has not only served as a symbolic cemetery and a public demonstration site, it has also become something like a truth commission in the transitional justice sense, even though the state did not admit accountability yet. Truth commissions, by the way, are not trials. They do not have juridical power, but they enable the public recognition of truth about past crimes. They empower the victims and survivors as basic sources of evidence, and they also give perpetrators an opportunity to diminish the burden of guilt. So during my interview with Masih Ocak and Sevda Arcan, who were among the initiators of the movement, both women emphasized that it would not have been possible for the relatives and the public to realize that enforced disappearance has been a systematic state policy unless new mothers and new witnesses kept showing up in the square and to tell their own stories. So this was a grassroots truth commission at work. Even though many individuals were lost in the regions of Kurdish majority, Istanbul's Galatasaray Square became the meeting point where relatives exercised their right to truth. Some relatives moved to Istanbul to be able to join this movement, which had better media coverage. Many had already migrated here to escape from conflict in eastern areas. Testimonies of perpetrators spread from mouth to mouth in these get-togethers, such as the one by Yıldırım Beyler, who confessed that he participated in the gendarme forces and he burned bodies in boilers and threw them out of helicopters. He identified these actions as a professional job, similar to the National Socialist Adolf Eichmann, whose trial has carried Hannah Arendt to notice that the darkness in the bureaucrats who dutifully follows order is the most commonplace, but therefore the most dangerous of all evils. Additionally, the Galatasaray Square has become a platform for prospective justice. In interviews, some relatives suggested that their public visibility prevented the state from committing new crimes, and the numbers of enforced disappearance actually decreased over time. Those who survived state custody came to these meetings and declared that the police spared them because they knew their mothers would join the movement. In short, the Saturday mothers' struggle for visibility in public space did not only remain a cry to be seen, but it also evolved into a truth-telling and corrective platform. So the association of the social movement with a specific public space transformed the gender-specific stereotypes as well. In some of the earliest academic articles, feminists criticized the Saturday mothers for perpetuating the connotation of womanhood with motherhood. This naming maintained the identification of the woman with her dependence on men, the argument said, and the media coverage of suffering mothers doubly victimized them as powerless women. Sometimes the name Saturday people is used to undo this gender specificity. But I think this critique does not take into account that the mothers transformed the traditional image of maternity as well over time. With their determination for 25 years, despite the police beatings and detentions, the mothers were mournful and peaceful, but they can hardly be described as passive or obedient. Appearing as a human rights defendant in the public space falsified any perception that confined a woman's place to the private realm as a caretaker of men, and resisted any political or social calculation to domesticate her. From the perspective of transitional justice, the mother is also an appropriate metaphor for the struggle against enforced disappearance, because state modernization establishes a contract with relatives over the protocols of burial. No burial can take place without state permission, which at the same time makes the state responsible for informing the relatives about the dead relatives. The state controls, classifies, guides, keeps track of dead bodies. But the authoritarian states also pushes them out of the burial protocol. Consequently, the relatives like mothers are eligible to claim and to go to court, to go to UN, to sue the state. And I think additionally, the Saturday mothers also detach the concept of maternity from its patriarchal biological association and show that a sibling, a partner, a child, a grandchild, or any citizen can become a mother of the deceased whose rights were violated. The Saturday mothers called the state to transform itself with values of care and love that are usually associated with motherhood. Namely, my argument is that the city square built this social movement, but also vice versa. In an exhibition about the 500 plus years of the Galatasaray school and square, 3 of the 10 contemporary artists rightfully inserted the Saturday mothers into the history of the area. For instance, one of these artworks, Saturday, the artist Barış Ülker transformed the iconography of a typical class photo into a blurred image composed of a collage of mothers holding the portrait photographs of the disappeared in front of the school's gate. The artist reproduced images from past 25 years on Xerox paper, reminiscence of street flyers, and transitioned them onto still surface. The choice of this medium resulted in layered images that blurred each other and mirror images that inverted the names of the disappeared, making them partially illegible. For the artist, the making of this pictorial fog was also a matter of personal healing. Remembering his early encounters with the Saturday Mothers demonstration, he said, I'm quoting, "I can see, but I'm also blinded by the weight of it all. I'm a teenager. I cannot come to terms with it. I walk on. It's a Saturday. It is every Saturday. I know this and I don't know it at all." So Ülker, the artist, questions himself for his failure to actually see the Saturday Mothers. He inhabits the role of the bystander. A group of quite diverse people joined in their silence in the face of violence. For years, the society resisted to see what could not be unseen and what Saturday Mothers really showed. So shortly after their demonstration was banned, a group of Saturday mothers visited this exhibition and left their red flowers under Ilker's work. The flowers that they would have brought to Galatasaray Square every week, and the flowers that they would have taken to cemeteries. Ilker's work also reminds us of the power of the portrait photograph, through which the disappeared appears in the city. Reports by human rights organizations expose that the authoritarian regimes learned the apparatus of enforced disappearance from each other, but so did the resistance. Over the years, the portrait photograph in the public space has consistently proven its power as a form of solidarity. Mothers of Argentina came up with very creative performances to make the disappeared appear in public space using silhouettes and masks. And the most common form has been the portrait photograph with the victim's name on it and a question about his whereabouts, which, like tweets, it jumps between Argentina, Turkey, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Iran, El Salvador, Ireland, and many other countries. Some demonstrators use state ID photographs, appropriating this disciplinary power's visual field into a subversive effect. The portrait photograph in public protest exposed the intrinsic unbelievability of the disappeared. Many authors who theorized photography, from Walter Benjamin to Susan Sontag, commented on the photograph's role in freezing time. In periods of transitional justice, time is also suspended because it affects the living and the dead, living dead differently. Nothing exemplifies this better than an anecdote of a Saturday mother. When she held up the portrait photograph of her husband, who disappeared in his 20s 30 years ago, someone asked her if she was looking for her son. She had aged, but her husband's portrait photograph had not. He has been the living dead, whose death has not been encountered yet. So the photo and audio installation on the wall by another artist, Aylin Tekiner, I think brings us face to face with this fact. Tekiner turns the camera away from the public square to the domestic spaces where mothers keep their memories of their disappeared. The audience puts the still image on the wall into time throughout the duration of the audio. Time passes for those in the living world, but it is frozen for those in the disappeared. The overwhelming presence of the portrait photograph is noticeable in the pictures, whether in size, placement, or relation to other objects. Many relatives make a connection between the portrait's photograph and the missing grave. Our graves are the melancholic photographs on our walls, Gülbahar Aksoy says, whereas another relative explains that they did not dare to put his brother's photographs on the wall for 34 years because that would have meant to admit his death. So the portrait photograph as witness in grassroots truth commissions and standing in for the missing body in suspended time brings me to my final point about the cemetery. After Truth and Justice, Saturday Mother's third public demand is a space for the remnants of their relatives. Over the years, as hopes that the relatives will return dwindled, the motto of the movement became, "We want the bones and to bury our dead," a request that actually reappeared in countless countries across the world. Bones were found years later under bridge piers. They resurfaced on lake shores. Bones were excavated from pits or revealed in truth commissions when perpetrators confessed. In Mexico, for instance, animal bones were sent to families to claim that the migrants had died in accidents, not even under state custody. So the missing graves of the disappeareds raises a question that Judith Butler asked: what makes for a grievable life? Why does the state consider some lives mournable, but others so unmournable that it denies them graves? So to discuss this question, I would like to draw your attention to the place of architectural history in Right to Truth, or urban history in Right to Truth, in Finding Truth. The physical environment can indeed be treated as a primary source of history and evidence in truth-telling. For that, we may look at the missing evidences, marks that the violent regimes erase to hide their crimes. In addition to those who search for the missing bones of their disappeared relatives, we may also turn to the disappeared, or hidden graveyards. The center of modern Istanbul, the broader Taksim area, in other words, is indeed one such area where major cemeteries has disappeared. If we zoom out of the Galatasaray Square, which is the center of Istanbul, to the broader, to the Taksim area, which is also the center of Istanbul, we would confront that the fact that in Istanbul it was not only the people but also the graveyards that disappeared. For instance, a map analysis reveals the disappearance of the Muslim small cemetery during Pera's transformation from a land of graves and graves to a city of elite households and hotels during Ottoman Empire's integration into capitalism. A scholar has researched this, Mehmet Kentel. He showed that the edges of the cemetery were in constant pressure due to the rising land prices during the growth of capitalism. Following the cholera epidemic in 1865, a wall was built around the cemetery, changing it from a public passageway to a recreational area and into a border between the wealthy and the poor parts of the town. When the tunnel, the second subway of the world, was constructed in 1873, the graveyard in the Mevlevi Lodge was expropriated, and the debris that came out of this excavation was dumped on the small cemetery with the conviction that the flattening of the slope would increase the real estate values. A new life started over the totally covered graves, and the area came to be known for its best views in the town that attracted tourists to these hotels. For instance, Frank Gehry has a project here. If Frank Gehry's design is constructed, its basement will be 9 floors deep so that cars will replace the bones in the spinal acts of graves, total obliteration. In the same area, there was another cemetery, the second cemetery around today's Taksim and Gezi Park area. It used to be the site of non-Muslim graves. After the cholera epidemic, and pressured by the real estate, a new land law in 1869 dictated to carry all cemeteries to the outskirts. Despite some public dissent, municipal authorities negotiated the relocation of Catholic, Protestant, and Greek Orthodox graves. The map of 1858, for instance, clearly shows the Greek cemetery at the entrance of today's Istiklal Street and the Catholic and Protestant cemeteries to the north of the Ottoman military artillery. The same map of 1882 no longer shows these cemeteries. It identifies the Greek cemetery now as the church and its garden, and the Catholic and Protestant cemeteries as the Taksim garden. But notice that the Armenian cemetery remains in both maps. Following a couple of attempts to expropriate the Armenian cemetery since 1855, the negotiations had remained unresolved when World War I broke out. After the Ottoman Empire dissolved, the Turkish Republic confiscated the lands in 1939 through unjustified but so-and-so legal means by manipulating the transition between the imperial and national legal regimes and by denying the Armenian patriarch the lawful ownership of the land. Such dispossessions of Armenian property, whose owners have been deported, exiled, or murdered, has been part of the denial statecraft and continuing climate of impunity in Turkey. Gezi Park and Intercontinental Hotel stand today on the older side of the relocated Catholic and Protestant cemeteries, while the Divan and Hyatt hotels, as well as a few modern buildings, stand on the older side of the confiscated Armenian cemetery. Revealing the history of an 8-year-long court case that resulted in this dispossession of the Armenian property in 1939, two historians said, quote, "Only after confrontation and official apology, perhaps we can finally bury our dead." So it's not a coincidence that both Saturday mothers and the legal historians of Armenian cemetery conclude their works with the same request, to bury their dead. Throughout their 25 years of demonstration, the Saturday mothers have shown solidarity with other historical atrocities in the country and have been joined by other activists. Even though the Saturday mothers are specifically looking for their relatives who disappeared with the 1918 military coup, they have drawn attention to similar episodes of state violence throughout the history of Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. For instance, in their 683rd meeting, they memorialized the 250 Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul who were subject to enforced disappearance on April 1915. This was one of the many episodes of demographic engineering on these lands, after which Turkey's 20% non-Muslim population was reduced to 2%. So the reason that authorities are so threatened by mothers of the disappeared around the world must be because they powerfully reveal an intrinsic truth about the nation-state apparatus. They expose how states exploit their dead in the name of the physical, economic, or ideological victory of one group over the other. That is why the Saturday Mothers Movement is more than a search for personal grieving. A mother's right to mourn is also a society's right to heal. And let me move to my third part. So my intention is not simply to locate spaces of political harm, but also to make a call to repurpose them as healing spaces. I would like to explore architectural programs and spaces of reparation by defining a healing space as one where political harm is confronted. While designing the Galatasaray Square, for instance, is it too hard to imagine a memorial to Saturday mothers? While designing the Taksim Square, is it too hard to imagine programs that return some of these sites to the descendants of historical victims? After Truth and Justice, Saturday Mothers' third public demand is a space, memorial, perhaps a symbolic cemetery. In this part, I would like to continue suggesting that architecture can take more proactive roles in transitional justice by engaging in accountability debates in earlier stages. So the memorials and monuments debates will not be unfamiliar to this audience also. Removing monuments from public spaces signifies the end of an era, the moment of transition, the need for change. One of the crucial topics today is the future of memorials, the future of commemoration, after confronting the violence of the past. How do monuments and memorials take accountability for violence, including slavery and colonialism, rather than simply celebrate history? How do memorials help healing from historical violence? By way of an answer, I present some ideas today about what I would call transitional justice memorials and analyze relevant examples from around the world. My implication is that US or Turkey or countries in Europe who are confronting their histories of state violence, slavery, and colonialism through public monuments might indeed get some inspiration from the experience of countries with a history of transitional justice, such as South Africa, Argentina, Germany, Bosnia, Rwanda, and others. So transitional justice memorials are different from war memorials because they reveal architecture's role in prospective justice. However, architects are usually excluded from the decisions over the need, site, representative, or narrative of these memorials. They are brought in only at the last stage to design the physical environment. I would like to make a case for a more proactive role, and let me discuss these memorials from the perspective of site, form, program, funding, and procedure. So, Saturday Mothers, of course, like all of the temporary installations and performances that Saturday Mothers, for instance, have already constructed every Saturday at Galatasaray Square or in their homes, are grassroots memorials. And yet, official apologies and memorials have an additional meaning, because they have an additional meaning in closure of grief, precisely because they are declarations of state accountability, they are declarations of acknowledging the right to truth. And let me start with the sites. During my meetings with the Saturday Mothers, we discussed possible locations for memorials, and a provisional list emerged. Galatasaray Square, of course, a public plaquette in front of every building where the disappeared were taken to state custody, or buildings that have been torture spaces, and so on. Or cemeteries where the disappeared bodies were found, or they are hoped to be buried. So this list envisions memorials both in found and constructed sites, namely both spaces where the trauma happened and the symbolic spaces that would be associated with healing by virtue of the memorial. Unlike those that prompted Robert Musil's critique that there is nothing as invisible as a monument, transitional justice memorials should no longer be sculptures to a handful of heroes on pedestals, but complex conceptions of sites where sculpture, architecture, landscape, design, performance, educational programs might be combined. They are not monuments to single leaders, but to healing ideas and values. These memorials may be located both in found and constructed sites. There are mixed opinions about ecology memorials that repurpose torture spaces. While such spaces strongly reveal historical violence, they may also perpetuate the trauma rather than healing. The location of the incomplete memory park in Argentina, as at the former torture chamber in Buenos Aires, raised hesitations for this reason. In contrast, in Chile, exposing and appropriating the violation spaces became a major transitional step, such as the uncovering of this villa as a secret police torture center. An additional concern is the site's visibility. A familiar critique of memorials is their participation in forgetting and whitewashing, despite their opposite intention. And the choice of location is not a trivial factor here. A frozen singular site in an obscure, distant place is likely to trivialize atrocities than multiple sites that are constantly animated with educational and art programs. The number and accessibility of Holocaust memorials all over the world are more likely to disseminate the necessary reminder, never again. In Chile, multiple memorial sites were allocated, such as several stadiums, in addition to 250 plaques to the victims of Pinochet. Most of these sites emerged with the determination of the local communities, such as the one in rural Paine, where houses of dozens of mosaics were constructed by the relatives of the victims. Another consideration is the physical design of the memorial. From a formal standpoint, transitional justice memorials have shaken architecture's confidence in monumentality. Modern monumentality has been a long, rising topic in architecture, but we can say that today, official state memorials had manipulated the collective memory by overemphasizing and stabilizing the dominant voice, and thus by taking part in cultural repression. A turning point came with Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the US, designed by Maya Lin, and it has served as one of the most recognized turning points from the viewpoint of form. In sharp contrast to classical scale and representation strategies of the surrounding monuments, Lin's memorial is hardly visible from a distance. Her gesture of inscribing on the walls more than 58,000 names of men and women who died in the war makes this a memorial to individual memories rather than the official narrative, or rather than a hero. So writing names of victims on walls to resist their erasure has proven to be an effective commemoration mode in other transitional justice memorials in Bosnia, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, and others. During the design of the monument to the victims of state terrorism in Argentina, it was a matter of controversy to decide which names to write on the wall. Acknowledging those who were subject to enforced disappearance after 1968 as opposed to 1976 would change the level of accountability of the state. So the memorial wrote some names that was revealed by the Truth Commission, but the architects decided to leave 21,000 steps empty, gesturing to the even higher number of victims suggested by human rights organizations. They did not just write the names that the state wanted, but they gestured to the fact that there were actually many more, 20,000 more disappeared bodies. The UVA memorial that has just been opened to enslaved laborers in the United States also gestures towards this need for further research and exploration. In Germany, a counter-monumental turn in public art took place with Holocaust memorials. Erecting memorials to Holocaust victims presented a set of problems. Given both the historical and ethnological connection between monuments and memory, and given that the association of monumentality with power, grandeur, prestige, and glory, how could one commemorate the Holocaust victims with a monumental expression? Or to follow Horkheimer and Adorno, if the Holocaust was a major scar on the face of modernity, raising a serious concern about its inherent inability to confront otherness and difference, how could one continue to use conventional monumental practices to represent Holocaust victims? So after 1990s, artists commemorated traumas with counter-monumental forms in response to this challenge. For example, Gers and Gers conceived their disappearing monument against fascism as a 12-meter pillar that was gradually lowered as citizens signed their names on it to indicate their rebellion against fascism. This interactive counter-monument was designed to vanish eventually challenging the very notion of permanence and stability that are usually attributed to traditional monuments. Daniel Libeskind or Eisenman both use counter-monumental strategies in their different ways to come up with this challenge. Or intertextuality between apology memorials is something else, another attribute. It speaks to the importance of transnational solidarity. So this memorial for peace and justice in Alabama, the so-called lynching memorial, both adds a wall of names in solidarity with the Bosnia and Washington memorial. It has this metaphor of lynching, but it also references Berlin Holocaust Memorial. Monuments to the victims of state terrorism in Argentina creates a cut, like the void of Libeskind's memorial, as a metaphor of the wound into which visitors enter. The visitors then reach the river that symbolizes the waters where bodies that were subject to enforced disappearance were dumped into. This is not an arbitrary reference. During the struggle for truth and justice, mothers of Plaza Mayo publicly said that they want their ashes to be thrown into waters. So in other words, transitional justice memorials bring the visitors face-to-face with the victims' experience rather than the victors' propaganda. And memorials to the Rwanda genocide have added a new layer. Unlike those that use replicas or represent traumas through mediated experiences, the Kigali Genocide Memorial Center displays actual human remains and bones of dead bodies. The Rwanda Genocide Memorials take their power from the architecturalization of the index of violence. Third, I would suggest the program as another consideration. Let's agree that additional research, education, and art programs that keep the memory site informative, social, and active, and that turn accountability into an evolving, open process are more meaningful than memorials that are frozen and isolated. The Memorial Museum thus emerged as a new program, such as the ones in South Africa, Colombia, Hungary, and Rwanda. These museums usually put the victim's experience at the center, and they also emphasize broadening the historical archives. Despite their role in healing, however, transitional justice memorials are still prone to unresolved issues. One of the dilemmas generates from the question of funding. Some human rights organizations, such as Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, refuse to accept state funding because they conceive this as a step towards releasing the state from its accountability. In Chile, it was the human rights organizations, individual activists, students that took the memorialization initiative. But current governments usually take these memorials opportunistically to whitewash their crimes, and this is a serious concern. However, the lack of state engagement and state funding throws these memorials into the market economy if they are to reach the broader public. The condition creates its own contradictions. Memorials erected after the end of dictatorship in Argentina and Chile were co-opted into the memory market as an extension of the simultaneous neoliberalization of the world. In a context where memory groups reject governmental support and need to survive in the market economy, trauma sites get integrated into tourism industry, and the never again motto becomes a brand. So if the state is not involved, memorials, the result is not an apology, and the state gets away from its financial burden, while memorialization is left to its own devices in a neoliberal world. If the state is too involved, it dictates its message in its own partiality and with continuing hierarchies. So in this context, societies need to find ways so that state is involved in the funding of management, but the narrative is democratized by involving many groups, including those that have been most affected. And of course, critical historiography needs to endure, and this has to be an open research process. Another contradiction is the implied ranking of suffering due to unequal monetary resources, space, and scale granted to different memorials. Nothing but the usual supremacy of Holocaust memorials at the expense of other victims expose this contradiction better. While the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe fortunately takes a vast space at the center of unified Berlin, other Nazi victims, such as the Roma and homosexual populations, hardly get commemorated in the same way. Moreover, Holocaust memorials in immigrant neighborhoods such as Berlin's Kreuzberg failed to triangulate German, Jewish, and immigrant memories, even though many intellectuals drew connections between historical and contemporary discrimination against Jewish and Muslim populations. So the exclusionary practice in the selective inclusion of victims brings me to the topic of identity politics. On the one hand, most conflicts are due to ethnic and racial discriminations, and truth-telling processes need to expose discrimination if societies are ever to confront their mistakes. On the other hand, the final goal of transitional justice is perpetual peace building, to put an end to conflicts. It's a delicate reconciliation, after which all involved parties shake hands in peace, so to speak. Any practice or memorial that fuels conflicts by reversing or constructing a new hierarchy between groups, or by planting seeds of violence, or by equating revenge with equality, all of these are about to distort the final intention of peace. So when Saturday mothers demand justice, they do not just ask justice for themselves, but they ask it in solidarity with other atrocities, which makes them an exemplary social movement for this reason as well. So in this context, we might ask, how could the architecture discipline give a forward momentum to transitional justice today? Obviously, memorials is not the only medium, but it is, nevertheless, can be a process, can be an artwork to start the process rather than conclude the process. For example, and this has happened before in America, the first place at the time for an assembly center to commemorate the interned 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II was placed before the official apology. It was followed by the reparations and official apology later. In other words, it was the memorial that started the process and demanded reparations rather than the other way around, which usually happens. Or the Chicago Torture Justice Center, for instance, designed the memorial first and now is asking for the mayor for the money and them to construct it and an apology to the trauma of police violence. So my point is, memorials to come may also imply transitions to come. So before I finish, let me make one last point about my case study. The Saturday Mothers movement is an exemplary grassroots healing struggle that is pushing the transitional justice to come. However, Turkey itself is a cautionary example that transitional justice measures will fail when they are imposed from above by international organizations. During the reconstitution of democracy after the 1980 military junta, Turkey is supposed to have gone through a transitional justice measure, but demanded by European Union and the UN. For instance, in this process, the president met the Saturday mothers, but this eventually proved to be only a tactical stage rather than a real measure, because mothers have received even more police violence since then. A similar process took place for all other episodes of historical violence. Most transitional justice measures, large or small, have been foreclosed or manipulated with tactical steps to maintain the stability of the current ruling party. For instance, the Ministry of Culture restored the Armenian church as a museum, and it publicized it as a demonstration of Turkish tolerance rather than confronting the genocide. Or the Statue of Humanity, which was the first Armenian-Turkish reconciliation memorial, was destroyed 2 years later because the president characterized it as a freak. To conclude, the story of Saturday Mothers as a prism to look at historical state violence around the world has carried me to acknowledge the necessity to both globalize and localize transitional justice, and to keep it as a continually open and self-reflective platform. A familiar and justified critique of human rights regime and international organizations such as UN is their inaugural Eurocentrism and hierarchical structure. However, this critique needs to be qualified with two considerations. The conception that human rights were invented in the West is not true, because there was a network of people's revolutions in the 18th century when the concept of human rights emerged. Non-Western revolutions contributed to this process as major chronological markers, such as the 18th Constitution in 1805 that abolished slavery. The assumption that the torch of human rights is carried by European and American nations is ungrounded, because the US, for instance, has only signed 5 out of 18 UN conventions. The grassroots struggles and the writing of international conventions against enforced disappearance that I discussed today constitute a case in point that human rights activism today is taking place with actors in countries outside the West. The global history of human rights needs to be written first and foremost by giving due acknowledgement to all its makers. By globalizing transitional justice, I mean the struggles to have all states sign the new human rights conventions and to make UN cosmopolitan. And let me remind you that it is local human rights associations that carry these struggles against their governments that refuse to participate in international law. By localizing transitional justice, I mean the translations between international and local justice systems, because transitions have a chance to be effective only if they are democratic and bottom-up. And Turkey is a case in point that top-down will not work. And conceiving, in other words, conceiving UN and grassroots activism or international and local justice as competitive struggles sabotages the protection of peoples. Instead, I think much more could be done through complementary processes and with its devices to analyze space and give physical shape to human rights activism. I think architecture can take a proactive role in this globalized, localized, and open transitional justice platforms. That is why I think a mother's right to mourn is also a world's right to heal. Thank you. Yes.
Esra, thank you so much. That was an amazing talk, and really appreciate you bringing these issues to the foreground.
Thank you. Maybe I can come a little closer.
I'm struggling to put my question together particularly, but I'm thinking about how powerful it is that bodies of the oppressed can collectively occupy space that was defined and created ostensibly as public space, i.e. for the public good, but really controlled by the oppressive regime in ways that are indefensible, right? And so that the kind of the architecture of the bodies of the mothers, albeit ephemeral, makes such a strong statement that has, real implications. That's just incredibly compelling to me, and I'm thinking of other installations like there's a Christoph Wodich's projections, right, in the portrait, flaming the facades of buildings with portraits of the spirit in places like Mexico and Argentina and more of a statement for the question that was involved.
Thank you so much. There are definitely a lot of examples that one could think of, and I kind of, when I arrived at the cemetery, because as an architect, I have to admit I was not paying enough attention to cemeteries and the disappearing cemeteries, and when I arrived at the question of looking at where the dead bodies are and where they are not, and how they have not been, in Judith Butler's work, they have not been deemed grievable by the state. When I started looking at that and discovering that there are so many severe cemeteries, and cemetery is actually the place that we can think a lot more as architects, I was thinking of similar things. And since then, maybe it's because I'm working on this, I've been paying attention to other architects who are exposing cemeteries. For instance, forensic architecture just had it released just a month ago, I think, a research where they, with their own tools, of course, they identified places where the bodies of the slaves must have been buried, but without acknowledgement and so on. So there is really, underneath our land, there's a history of people who have been subject to violence and human rights violations and so on. So, looking underneath was never, it never occurred to me that that's a problem, but I think I've been noticing more and more how important it is for an urban historian and how identifying these mass graves that have been hidden through tools like forensic architecture uses and so on can be a new platform of struggle to expose historical violence and do something about it.
I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit more about the difference between or connections between the global and the local, because the issue of the state is also part of that, right? So if we say that state violence is the worst kind of violence, following Walter Benjamin, then how does the state relate to the local as a place of power, and how does that then move on to the global? It's one of the most interesting parts of your talk, and I'd just like to hear you talk more about it.
Thank you so much. I mean, in a way, even after the violent state goes away, the new state uses this opportunistically and so on. So in that sense, there needs to be, I think, mechanisms and solidarity groups, civil society organizations, architects participating in that makes the states do the right thing. And the state will never, usually, I have seen kind of authoritarian states saying, I'm going to do the right thing and employ a right to truth. And so usually it is when it comes from the public that happens. So by both globalizing and localizing transitional justice, I meant, and sometimes it is the international pressure that makes the states institute a truth commission and so on, and the state doesn't do it, but when it's an international pressure. So what I meant by both globalizing and localizing is that we need those international institutions for the sake of humanity. But when those international institutions, as they have done in the past, come and say, okay, I know how to bring justice here, you have to do this, you have to do that, and so on, it doesn't work. And ethnographic studies have also shown that justice doesn't mean the same thing in different places. What the UN official thinks justice is doesn't necessarily translate that well in the local context. So by localizing global transitional justice, I meant translating those mechanisms into the local context. I mean, justice may mean punishment, it may mean forgiveness, and it does mean these different things in different contexts. So, that's what I meant. I meant we need both the international institutions, and we need everyone every state to sign the Human Rights Convention. It's kind of, I think, I don't know, that the US signed only 5 of them. The US has signed the rights to the child, or of course the Supreme Laws, I think, are things that can be discussed. I mean, I think that there needs to be, by globalizing transition justice, I meant every state taking accountability for the human rights violations, and by localizing it, I meant not imposing transition justice mechanisms mot-à-mot to new locations. And usually one of the things that happens is that the international forces and local forces are seen as competing forces, like UN forces and local forces are seen as competing forces because of this critique that human rights is Eurocentric and so on and so forth. First, we need to write the history well, that human rights has not been invented in the West, it has been invented globally. Second, we need to stop, I think, seeing international and local forces as competing forces, but we need to see them as complementary forces. So we need both of these institutions. We need both the local civil rights organizations, people on the ground, social movements, and so on, but we also need some international institutions to step in when the local governments or states is actually have guns and violating some people. Does that answer your question? Or does it
Yeah, I guess
elevation enough?
Yeah. So the state though is not the same as the global, the local, and that's kind of key, right? That the state is somewhere in between those institutions, not necessarily the best player in that. Right?
Yeah, exactly. The state is local and global.
I was really interested in this idea of the image of the disappeared person and sort of the fixing of age relative to the mother. One continues to age while the person gets sort of fixed in time. And I was just thinking about that in relationship to monuments versus the appropriation of these sort of vital public spaces, and how, I'm not sure, like you see a lot, like say the border wall in the US, or various squares, Kettner Square, so forth, and the square in Istanbul, the appropriation, there's a lot of power in the appropriation, and it's a vital power that sort of continues and isn't fixed in time, whereas even like the Maya Lin Memorial in some sense, or certainly some of the other attempts at memorialization can, I think, have that effect maybe. I'm sort of wondering, it's my question of doing that kind of fixing the thing in time, which I wonder if the capacity is as vital as when it's an appropriation of a public space that is often controlled by the very state that you're protesting against. So I wondered, can the memorial escape that sort of fixing in time, or is the role of the memorial different than say the public space?
Yeah. So obviously there are several ways of doing good memorial, and I don't want to say this is the best way. And counter monuments or transitional justice memorials have to come to terms with this idea of permanence, that traditional monuments are about permanence and fixing and so on. So how can someone do otherwise? So transience or change is one of the ways that in transitional justice memorials work with. For instance, this disappearing monuments in Harburg is one of them, or monuments that are activated with performances. For instance, the UVA memorial, it's a stage and it changes with the performance that happens in it. So there are definitely artists thinking about this issue of permanence and not doing something permanent, but something that changes all the time, appropriated and so on. But I don't want to say that that's the only way to do a transitional memorial, transitional justice memorial. Obviously, it's where the design comes in. Not doing something transient and having it open and possible for appropriation, possible for disappearance, is one way of doing a good transitional justice memorial, but it's not the only way. There definitely this issue of how permanent should it be, how fixed should it be, is a major, you're right, it's a major concern precisely because traditional monuments are all about fixing, freezing, and remembering it forever as it would.
Or even like the way Maya Lin's memorial is now getting repeated and repeated and has become its own sort of historical.
Exactly, so the writing of names have become a gesture of transnational solidarity. Thank you for